Every time you ignore the spirit, the flesh grows stronger. Every time you ignore the spirit, the flesh grows stronger. This is not a metaphor meant to sound poetic or dramatic. It is a spiritual law that quietly governs the inner life of every human being. The struggle between spirit and flesh is not something that happens once in a lifetime, nor is it reserved for monks, saints, or deeply religious individuals. It is a daily, moment-by-moment conflict that unfolds in the unseen realm of thoughts, desires, impulses, and choices. Most people lose this battle without ever realizing they were in one. The spirit speaks softly. It does not shout. It does not rush. It does not manipulate through fear or pleasure. The spirit invites, nudges, convicts, and waits. The flesh, on the other hand, is loud, impatient, and persuasive. It demands immediate satisfaction. It offers comfort, escape, validation, and relief from discomfort. When the spirit is ignored repeatedly, the flesh does not merely remain present, it expands its influence. It becomes more confident, more demanding, and eventually more controlling. Many people believe that spiritual weakness is caused by sudden moral failure or dramatic sin. In reality, spiritual weakness is almost always the result of small, repeated moments of neglect. Ignoring the spirit once may seem harmless. Ignoring it twice may feel justified. Ignoring it habitually reshapes the inner hierarchy of your life. What once whispered now dominates. What once guided now fades into silence. This message is not about condemnation, it is about awareness. You cannot fight a war you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot reclaim spiritual authority while feeding the very impulses that undermine it. This is about understanding how the flesh gains strength, how the spirit is silenced, and why the consequences are far deeper than most people realize. What follows is not theory, it is observation. It is the anatomy of an inner collapse that happens quietly in millions of lives every day, and it is also the beginning of understanding how to reverse it. The first, silence. How ignoring the spirit begins the strengthening of the flesh. The strengthening of the flesh does not begin with rebellion. It begins with silence. Specifically, the silence that forms when the spirit speaks and you choose not to respond. This moment is often subtle. It does not feel like a decisive turning point. It feels small, almost insignificant. Yet spiritually, it is one of the most critical moments in a person's inner life. The spirit rarely commands with force. Instead, it communicates through clarity, restraint, discomfort with certain thoughts, or a quiet sense that something is misaligned. It may urge you to pause before reacting, to walk away from temptation, to remain silent instead of proving a point, or to choose discipline over indulgence. When this prompting is ignored, the flesh interprets it as permission. At first, the flesh does not grow stronger instantly. It grows bolder. It tests boundaries. It observes that nothing immediately catastrophic happens when the spirit is dismissed. This creates a false sense of safety. The mind begins to rationalize. It's not that serious. I'll deal with it later. This doesn't define me. These thoughts are not neutral. They are the flesh learning how to speak on your behalf. Silence toward the spirit is not neutral space. It is occupied territory. The moment the spirit's voice is dismissed, another voice fills the gap. The flesh thrives in ambiguity and delay. It does not need outright rejection of spiritual guidance. It only needs postponement. Later is often the flesh's most effective strategy. Over time, this pattern reshapes perception. What once felt wrong now feels familiar. What once caused discomfort now feels justified. The flesh gains strength, not because it suddenly became powerful, but because it encountered no resistance. Just as muscles grow through repeated use, the flesh grows through repeated indulgence and unchecked impulse. This is why people often say they drifted away from spiritual sensitivity. Drifting implies passivity, but what actually happened was a series of choices, each one small, each one seemingly harmless, each one reinforcing the authority of the flesh. The spirit did not disappear, it was drowned out. As the flesh grows stronger, it begins to reinterpret reality. It reframes selfishness as self-care, avoidance as peace, indulgence as freedom, and compromise as wisdom. The spirit, which calls for truth, discipline and alignment, begins to feel restrictive by comparison. This is not because the spirit changed, but because the flesh has altered the lens through which guidance is perceived. Eventually, the person no longer notices the spirit's absence. This is the most dangerous stage. The flesh does not want open rebellion. It wants quiet dominance. It wants you functional, distracted, and convinced that nothing is truly wrong. At this point, spiritual sensitivity has not been destroyed. It has been neglected into dormancy. The tragedy is that many people attempt to fight the flesh at its strongest point, without addressing how it gained that strength. They seek sudden transformation, without revisiting the initial silence that empowered the flesh in the first place. True spiritual restoration always begins by restoring responsiveness to the spirit, not by attacking symptoms. The flesh grows stronger every time the spirit is ignored because authority follows attention. Whatever you listen to consistently becomes your guide. Whatever you dismiss consistently loses influence. This is not punishment. It is structure. It is how the inner world is organized. Reversing this process does not begin with dramatic declarations. It begins by breaking the silence. It begins by responding to the spirit again, even when the response feels inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly. The flesh resists this, not because it is evil in abstraction, but because it fears losing control. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, understand this clearly. Awareness is already the beginning of weakening the flesh. The spirit has not stopped speaking, it has been waiting. If this message is helping you see the spiritual battle more clearly, subscribe to the channel so you can continue strengthening the spirit and breaking the silent patterns that empower the flesh. The flesh does not conquer the spirit through force, it conquers through habit. Most people misunderstand this, believing that spiritual failure is the result of overwhelming temptation or sudden weakness. In truth, the flesh gains its strongest foothold not in moments of crisis, but in daily routines that slowly train the soul to obey impulse rather than truth. Habits are the language the flesh speaks fluently. They are the invisible architecture through which desire becomes identity and impulse becomes direction. Every habit is a vote, not just a behavioral vote, but a spiritual one. Each repeated action reinforces a particular authority within you. When a habit aligns with the spirit, it strengthens clarity, restraint, patience, and inner order. When a habit aligns with the flesh, it strengthens impulsivity, distraction, avoidance, and emotional reactivity. Over time, these habits do not merely influence behavior, they shape perception. You begin to see the world through the lens your habits have built. The flesh loves habits because habits remove the need for conscious decision-making. Once something becomes habitual, it no longer feels like a choice. It feels automatic. This is precisely why the flesh invests so heavily in repetition. The flesh does not need you to deny the spirit outright. It only needs you to act without awareness. When awareness disappears, the flesh operates freely. At first, habits form as responses to discomfort. Stress seeks relief, boredom seeks stimulation, loneliness seeks validation, fear seeks control. These responses feel justified, even necessary. The flesh presents them as coping mechanisms rather than compromises. Yet each time relief is chosen over alignment, the flesh learns how to manage the soul's discomfort more effectively than the spirit is allowed to. The spirit often calls for endurance rather than escape. It invites you to remain present with discomfort long enough for transformation to occur. The flesh rejects this invitation. It offers faster solutions that bypass growth. Over time, the soul becomes conditioned to avoid stillness, silence, and reflection, because these are the environments where the spirit speaks most clearly. This is why modern life is saturated with distraction. Constant stimulation is not accidental. It serves the flesh perfectly. When the mind is always occupied, the spirit has no space to surface. The flesh does not need to argue against spiritual truth. It only needs to keep you busy enough to forget it. Habits of distraction are among the flesh's most powerful tools. As habits deepen, they begin to redefine what feels normal. Discipline starts to feel extreme, silence feels uncomfortable, restraint feels unnecessary. The flesh reframes spiritual practices as burdens rather than lifelines. This shift does not happen overnight. It happens gradually through repetition until resistance to the spirit feels natural and obedience feels foreign. Eventually, the flesh no longer needs temptation, it has routine. Routine is far more effective. Temptation can be resisted. Habit feels inevitable. When someone says they feel stuck, what they often mean is that their habits have outgrown their awareness. The flesh has been rehearsing its authority daily, while the spirit has been neglected. This is why good intentions fail without structural change. Many people desire spiritual growth while maintaining the same daily rhythms that feed the flesh. This creates internal contradiction. You cannot starve the flesh with thoughts alone while feeding it with behavior. Habits are nourishment. Whatever you practice consistently becomes strong. The flesh also uses emotional habits. Patterns of resentment, self-pity, comparison, and justification become emotional reflexes. These reflexes shape identity. A person who habitually justifies themselves loses the ability to repent. A person who habitually blames others loses the ability to reflect. A person who habitually escapes discomfort loses the ability to endure growth. One of the most dangerous habits the flesh forms is the habit of delay. I will change later. I will take this seriously when life slows down. I will reconnect spiritually when things improve. Delay feels harmless, but it is deeply reinforcing. It trains the soul to believe that obedience is optional and that urgency belongs only to the flesh's desires. As these habits accumulate, the flesh gains what feels like momentum. This momentum is often mistaken for personality. People say, "This is just how I am," without realizing that who they have become is the product of what they have practiced. The flesh hides behind identity to protect its habits. It convinces you that change would mean losing yourself, when in truth, change would mean reclaiming yourself. The spirit does not compete loudly with habit. It waits. It waits for interruption. It waits for awareness. It waits for the moment you recognize that what feels normal is not necessarily what is right. This recognition is uncomfortable because it threatens the stability the flesh has built. Yet without disruption, habit remains unchallenged. Breaking the strength of the flesh does not begin with dramatic resolve. It begins with interrupting automaticity. One conscious pause can weaken a habit's authority. One moment of awareness can expose how deeply the flesh has embedded itself in routine. The flesh fears interruption more than failure. Failure can be rationalized. Interruption forces truth. The spirit grows stronger when obedience becomes practiced rather than occasional. Just as the flesh trained itself through repetition, the spirit regains influence through consistency. Small, deliberate acts of alignment rebuild sensitivity. Silence becomes tolerable again. Discipline becomes meaningful. Stillness becomes nourishing. Many people underestimate how long it takes to retrain the inner world. They grow discouraged when immediate change does not occur. This discouragement often pushes them back into old habits, reinforcing the flesh once more. True transformation requires patience because you are not just changing behavior, you are rewiring authority. The flesh will resist this process subtly. It will suggest that spiritual discipline is unnecessary, extreme, or unsustainable. It will remind you of past failures to discourage future effort. It will try to make you negotiate with it rather than confront it. This is why clarity matters. You cannot negotiate with a force that benefits from confusion. The strengthening of the spirit requires replacing habits, not merely removing them. Empty space will always be occupied by something. If old routines are abandoned without new structures, the flesh will return stronger. Intentional practice is essential. What you do daily becomes who you are spiritually. Over time, as new habits take root, perception shifts again. What once felt difficult becomes natural. What once felt restrictive becomes freeing. This is not because the flesh has disappeared, but because it has lost its unchecked authority. The spirit does not eliminate desire, it orders it. If you find yourself struggling repeatedly in the same areas, do not ask only why you are weak. Ask what you are practicing. Look honestly at your routines, your reflexes, your emotional responses. The flesh grows strong where it is rehearsed. The spirit grows strong where it is honored. If this teaching is helping you recognize how habits shape your spiritual authority, subscribe to the channel so you can continue learning how to weaken the flesh and restore the spirit's rightful place in your life. The flesh grows strongest when it becomes invisible. Not invisible in the sense that its actions disappear, but invisible in the sense that its motives are no longer questioned. At this stage, the flesh no longer presents itself as temptation or rebellion. It presents itself as reason, instinct, common sense, and even wisdom. This is one of its most dangerous evolutions, because when the flesh begins to sound reasonable, the spirit is often dismissed as impractical, extreme, or unnecessary. Many people assume that spiritual conflict looks dramatic. They imagine obvious moral choices, clear lines between right and wrong, moments where the soul stands at a crossroads and must choose one path or another. But the most decisive battles rarely look like this. They occur in subtle rationalizations, quiet justifications, and internal narratives that excuse compromise while maintaining a sense of self-respect. The flesh understands that most people do not want to see themselves as indulgent, weak, or misaligned, so it adapts its language. Instead of saying, ignore the spirit, it says, be realistic. Instead of saying, avoid discipline, it says, don't be too hard on yourself. Instead of saying, choose comfort over growth, it says, you deserve this. These statements feel harmless, even compassionate, but they often function as permission slips for spiritual neglect. This is how the flesh hijacks discernment. Discernment is meant to be the ability to recognize what aligns with truth beyond immediate emotion or desire. When the flesh gains influence, discernment is replaced by preference. What feels good becomes what feels right. What feels difficult becomes what feels unnecessary. The spirit's guidance, which often leads through discomfort toward transformation, begins to feel out of touch with real life. Over time, this distortion reshapes moral intuition. Actions are no longer evaluated by whether they align with truth, but by whether they disrupt comfort. Choices are no longer weighed by long-term consequence, but by short-term relief. The flesh trains the mind to prioritize immediate emotional equilibrium over inner integrity. One of the clearest signs that the flesh has strengthened is the way a person responds to conviction. Conviction is not condemnation. It is clarity. It is the spirit illuminating misalignment so that correction is possible. When the flesh dominates, conviction feels like an attack. It triggers defensiveness instead of reflection. The person feels the need to explain, justify, or deflect rather than listen. This defensiveness is crucial to understand. It is not merely emotional, it is strategic. The flesh knows that honest self-examination threatens its authority, so it builds mental barriers. It reframes feedback as judgment, accountability as control, and spiritual guidance as pressure. Anything that might restore the spirit's influence is recast as harmful. As this pattern deepens, self-deception becomes normalized. The person may still speak spiritual language, maintain outward practices, or associate with faith-based ideas, but the inner posture has shifted. The spirit is no longer leading, it is being referenced. There is a difference. Referencing the spirit allows one to feel aligned without being transformed. This is why people can appear spiritually engaged while remaining inwardly stagnant. The flesh does not oppose spirituality outright. It co-opts it. It uses spiritual concepts to protect its habits. It adopts language without submitting to authority. This creates an illusion of growth that masks inner erosion. Another subtle way the flesh strengthens itself is through emotional narrative. Stories such as, "This is just a season, God understands," or "Everyone struggles with this," can be true in isolation. But when used repeatedly to avoid change, they become shields. The flesh hides behind grace to avoid discipline, forgetting that grace is meant to empower transformation, not excuse stagnation. The longer this continues, the more the spirit's voice feels distant, not because it has stopped speaking, but because the internal environment has grown too loud. Rationalization creates noise. Justification creates static. The spirit speaks in clarity, and clarity cannot compete with constant mental negotiation. Eventually, the flesh establishes what feels like moral equilibrium. The person no longer feels acute guilt or conviction. This is often mistaken for peace, but peace is not the absence of discomfort, it is the presence of alignment. What the flesh offers instead is numbness. Numbness feels stable, but it is spiritually lifeless. This numbness is dangerous because it removes urgency. Without urgency, there is no movement. Without movement, there is no growth. The soul remains functional but dormant. The person continues living, working, interacting, yet something essential remains untouched. This is how people drift for years without obvious collapse. Yet without genuine transformation, the flesh thrives in this state because it no longer needs to argue. It has settled into control. It no longer tempts loudly. It manages quietly. At this point, the greatest threat to the flesh is honesty. Not dramatic repentance, not emotional breakdown, but simple, sober truth. This is not alignment. This is comfort masquerading as wisdom. Endure. The spirit begins to regain influence the moment this honesty emerges. Awareness weakens the flesh's grip. When rationalizations are named for what they lose power. The flesh depends on ambiguity. It cannot survive sustained clarity. However, clarity is uncomfortable. When the spirit's light returns, it reveals not only misalignment but also lost time. This realization can trigger shame, regret, or grief. The flesh uses these emotions to push the person back into numbness, whispering that change is too late or too difficult. This is another lie. The spirit does not measure readiness by perfection or speed. It responds to willingness. Even after long neglect, responsiveness restores connection. The flesh wants you to believe that delay has disqualified you. The spirit invites you to believe that honesty has reopened the door. As discernment is restored, values shift again. What once felt reasonable now feels hollow. What once felt necessary now feels excessive. This shift is subtle but profound. It signals that authority is changing hands. The flesh resists this transition fiercely, often increasing internal resistance, doubt, or fatigue. This resistance is not failure. It is evidence that the flesh is losing unchallenged control. True spiritual strength is not marked by the absence of desire, but by the presence of discernment. The Spirit does not eliminate complexity, it orders it. It allows a person to feel desire without being ruled by it, to experience emotion without being directed by it, to engage the world without being absorbed by it. The flesh fears this order because it thrives in chaos and immediacy. It needs reaction, it needs urgency, it needs distraction. When discernment returns, reaction slows, choice becomes intentional, silence becomes tolerable. These are signs of spiritual authority reasserting itself. If you find yourself questioning long-held habits, reassessing motivations, or feeling discomfort with what once felt normal, do not retreat. This is not confusion, it is recalibration. The Spirit is not dismantling your life. It is reordering it. The flesh grows strongest when it convinces you that comfort is wisdom and avoidance is peace. The Spirit grows strongest when you choose truth over ease, clarity over comfort, and alignment over familiarity. This choice does not happen once. It happens repeatedly, quietly, and often unnoticed by others. If this message is helping you recognize how the flesh disguises itself as reason and how discernment can be restored, subscribe to the channel so you can continue learning how to weaken the flesh and live led by the Spirit rather than ruled by impulse. The flesh reaches its most entrenched power when it learns how to weaponize emotion. At this stage, desire no longer appears merely as appetite or impulse. It presents itself as feeling, reaction, mood, and emotional necessity. Many people believe emotions are neutral signals that must always be honored. The flesh exploits this belief. It convinces the soul that whatever is felt must be acted upon, defended, expressed, or satisfied. In doing so, emotion becomes authority, and the Spirit is reduced to a distant observer. Emotions are not enemies of the Spirit, but they are not leaders either. They are indicators, not commanders. When the Spirit is ignored repeatedly, emotional reactions step into the vacuum of leadership. Anger decides what is said. Fear decides what is avoided. Desire decides what is pursued. Resentment decides what is remembered. Over time, a person no longer lives from conviction but from reaction. The flesh thrives in this environment because reaction requires no discipline and no patience. One of the most subtle lies the flesh tells is that suppressing emotion is the same as spiritual maturity. This is false. Suppression still grants emotion authority. It simply hides it. The Spirit does not call for suppression, but for submission. Emotion is meant to be brought under discernment, not silenced or obeyed blindly. When emotion is neither examined nor restrained, it becomes the steering wheel of the soul. The flesh prefers emotional immediacy. It wants release now, relief now, validation now. The Spirit often invites restraint, waiting, and internal processing. This difference creates tension. When a person has been trained by the flesh, restraint feels unnatural and even unhealthy. Emotional expression is equated with authenticity, while emotional discipline is framed as repression. This framing benefits the flesh greatly. As emotional habits form, patterns emerge. Certain triggers reliably produce certain reactions. A comment leads to defensiveness. A delay leads to frustration. A perceived slight leads to withdrawal. These patterns feel automatic because they have been rehearsed repeatedly. The flesh strengthens through these rehearsals. Every time an emotional reaction goes unchecked, it reinforces the idea that emotion is truth. This is why many people feel justified even when they are misaligned. Emotional certainty replaces moral clarity. "I feel this strongly" becomes evidence enough. The Spirit's quieter voice, which often questions initial reactions, is dismissed as overthinking or self-doubt. In reality, it is discernment attempting to intervene. The flesh also uses emotional memory as a weapon. Past wounds, disappointments, and betrayals are stored and revisited. These memories shape present behavior. Instead of responding to the current moment, the person reacts to accumulated emotion. This gives the flesh long-term leverage. It ensures that unresolved pain continues to dictate present choices. Forgiveness, restraint, and emotional processing weaken the flesh significantly. This is why the flesh resists them so strongly. It frames forgiveness as weakness, restraint as denial, and processing as unnecessary. Yet these practices remove emotion from the throne of authority and return it to its proper place. Another way the flesh gains power through emotion is by exaggerating urgency. Emotional urgency pressures immediate action. Say it now, leave now, indulge now. The spirit rarely operates through panic. It brings clarity, not haste. When decisions are made under emotional urgency, the flesh almost always benefits. Over time, living reactively exhausts the soul. Emotional highs and lows create instability. The person feels constantly drained, yet unable to rest. This exhaustion is often misdiagnosed as burnout from life circumstances, when in reality it is burnout from internal chaos. The flesh does not offer rest, it offers distraction. True rest requires order, and order requires authority. When the spirit begins to regain influence, one of the first changes is emotional slowing. Reactions pause, space appears between feeling and action. This space is uncomfortable at first because it removes familiar patterns. The flesh interprets this discomfort as danger and urges a return to immediacy. This pause is crucial. It is where freedom lives. In that pause, emotion can be observed rather than obeyed. Fear can be acknowledged without being followed. Anger can be felt without being expressed destructively. Desire can be recognized without being indulged. This is not emotional denial. It is emotional mastery. The flesh fears mastery because mastery restores choice. As long as emotion rules, the flesh can guide behavior effortlessly. Once mastery returns, the flesh must negotiate again, and it is weak in negotiation when clarity is present. Many people resist this stage because it feels like losing intensity. Emotional restraint is mistaken for dullness. In truth, it is depth. The spirit does not flatten emotion. It stabilizes it. It allows joy without addiction, sorrow without despair, and desire without enslavement. The more the spirit leads emotional life, the less dramatic inner experience becomes, but the more meaningful it is. Life stops feeling like a series of reactions and starts feeling like a path. This threatens the flesh deeply because it thrives on turbulence. Turbulence creates dependence. Calm creates sovereignty. If you notice that your strongest struggles emerge during emotional intensity, understand that this is not accidental. The flesh times its influence to moments when discernment is weakest. Learning to pause during emotion is one of the most powerful spiritual disciplines available. Restoring the spirit's authority over emotion does not eliminate feeling, it redeems it. Emotion becomes information rather than instruction. It serves awareness instead of ruling behavior. This shift weakens the flesh profoundly. If this message is helping you understand how emotion can quietly empower the flesh and how spiritual authority is restored through restraint and awareness, subscribe to the channel so you can continue strengthening the spirit and reclaiming inner order. The flesh reaches its final and most deceptive form of strength when it convinces a person that nothing truly needs to change. At this stage, the struggle between spirit and flesh no longer feels like a struggle at all. It feels settled, stable, acceptable. This is the most dangerous condition because the absence of conflict is mistaken for peace, when in reality it is surrender. The flesh no longer needs to fight loudly. It has achieved quiet dominance. In this state, life often appears outwardly functional. Responsibilities are met, relationships continue, routines remain intact. There is no dramatic collapse, no obvious moral failure that forces reflection. This is precisely why the flesh prefers this outcome. It allows spiritual stagnation to persist indefinitely without triggering alarm. The person is not overtly rebellious, but neither are they responsive. They are spiritually inactive while remaining psychologically busy. The flesh thrives when spiritual hunger fades. Hunger creates movement. Hunger drives seeking. Hunger exposes dissatisfaction. When hunger disappears, the soul stops searching. Many people believe that losing spiritual hunger means they have matured, that they no longer need intensity, urgency, or depth. In truth, loss of hunger often signals loss of alignment. Growth does not eliminate desire for truth. It deepens it. One of the flesh's most effective strategies at this stage is normalization. Patterns that once felt troubling are reframed as just life. A disconnection is labeled realism. Emotional distance is labeled maturity. Lack of discipline is labeled balance. The spirit's call to deeper alignment begins to sound unnecessary, even intrusive. The person may still believe in spiritual truth, but no longer feels personally addressed by it. This creates a dangerous internal divide. The mind agrees with spiritual principles, but the will no longer moves toward them. Knowledge replaces obedience. Agreement replaces surrender. The flesh is comfortable with this arrangement because it neutralizes transformation while preserving self-image. Over time, spiritual language becomes abstract. Teachings are appreciated intellectually but resisted practically. Conviction is replaced by commentary. The person can discuss spiritual concepts fluently while remaining unchanged by them. This is not hypocrisy in the dramatic sense. It is disconnection. The spirit is no longer encountered as a living guide, but as an idea. At this point, the flesh also reframes resistance as wisdom. Caution becomes an excuse for immobility. Past failures are used as justification for present avoidance. The soul becomes protective rather than receptive. Protection feels safe, but it prevents renewal. The flesh prefers preservation over transformation because transformation threatens its control. Another hallmark of this stage is spiritual fatigue, not physical tiredness, but inner weariness at the thought of effort, discipline, or depth. The idea of realignment feels exhausting rather than energizing. This fatigue is not caused by the spirit demanding too much. It is caused by prolonged inner misalignment. Carrying the weight of self-rule without guidance drains the soul. The flesh also encourages comparison at this stage. It points to others who appear worse, more broken, more indulgent, and uses them as reference points. At least you're not like that. This comparison dulls urgency. It shifts focus outward rather than inward. The spirit never compares, it calls personally. In this settled state, the greatest danger is not sin, excess, or collapse. It is indifference. Indifference requires no defense, no justification, no struggle. It simply coexists with spiritual truth without responding to it. The flesh prefers indifference because it is stable and quiet. Nothing challenges it there. Yet even here the spirit has not withdrawn. It has become faint but not absent. It waits beneath layers of routine, distraction, and resignation. The spirit does not force awakening. It responds to openness. The smallest crack of honesty is enough to begin reversal. Reawakening often begins with dissatisfaction that cannot be explained externally. Life may appear fine, yet something feels hollow. Pleasure no longer satisfies. Distraction no longer refreshes. Achievement no longer fulfills. This emptiness is not failure. It is invitation. The flesh interprets it as boredom or burnout and offers more stimulation. The spirit interprets it as readiness. The moment a person stops asking, "How do I maintain this life?" and starts asking, "What am I avoiding?" Authority begins to shift. This question destabilizes the flesh because it exposes the cost of comfort. Comfort always demands something in return, and that cost is usually depth. True spiritual restoration does not begin with dramatic emotion or radical behavior change. It begins with willingness to be disturbed by truth. The flesh fears disturbance. It wants calm without clarity. The spirit offers clarity that leads to peace, not numbness. When the spirit regains influence, sensitivity returns slowly. Conviction reappears gently. Desire for alignment resurfaces quietly. This process requires patience because the flesh resists urgency. It prefers gradual erosion over sudden collapse. Reclaiming spiritual authority is often subtle, but it is cumulative. The flesh will attempt one final defense: resignation. This is just who you are. Change is unrealistic. Depth is for others. These thoughts are not conclusions, they are barriers. The spirit counters them not with argument but with invitation. Come back. They pay attention. Respond. The difference between spiritual life and spiritual stagnation is responsiveness. Not perfection, not intensity, responsiveness. The flesh grows strongest where responsiveness dies. The spirit grows strongest where responsiveness is restored. Every time you ignore the spirit, the flesh grows stronger. But the reverse is also true. Every time you respond, even slightly, the flesh weakens. Authority shifts with attention. Alignment grows with obedience. Freedom expands with awareness. If this teaching has helped you understand how the flesh reaches its deepest control and how spiritual authority can still be restored, subscribe to the channel so you can continue strengthening the spirit and living with clarity, discipline, and truth.